Let's take a look at this video.
Carried water on their heads instead of inventing the wheel. That wasn't an accident. Europeans didn't evolve because of harsher weather. Because if that was the case, then why did we keep going with it? To create ballrooms, cathedrals, castles, art, music, literature, master the sciences, and then sail the seven seas. And why is it that these people had a 200,000 year head start on us? Perfect weather conditions, the most resource abundant continent on the planet, and they still couldn't create what we have. Well, I'll tell you, it's because we are genetically predisposed to be the way we are, and they are as well. And left to their own devices, they would still be running around in tribes without a written language. That's why you can introduce them into a first world society, and they act the exact same way. We have 6 cubic inches of brain material that they don't. And that's not just dormant, that is hard at work. We are not the same as these people, not even close. And that's why the media tries so hard to prop these people up, make you think they're equal, because once you mix, there's no going back. IQ is genetic, and that's why there's such an attack on white identity right now, because whenever you realize you've been endowed with special gifts from your creator, you're going to handle yourself completely different in this world.
So this individual actually follows me on Instagram, so clearly some of my content resonates with him. Because of that, I do want to keep the video respectful, calm, and focus on facts instead of insults. Hopefully he's willing to listen to everything, and hopefully the rest of you guys are willing to listen too. So he makes several claims. I'm going to try to remember it all. It all boils down to one idea. Europeans are genetically superior to Africans. So let's start with his first claim with the wheel. He says Africans carried water on their heads instead of inventing the wheel. And he brought that up to prove that they don't have intelligence. And that's not always how technology works. First of all, let's talk about the practical uses of it. A wheel is only useful when you have roads, suitable terrain, drift animals, and enough freight to justify carts. Large parts of tropical Africa, it had dense forests, seasonal mud, limited road systems, and certain diseases spread by the tsetse fly. And that made horses and oxen difficult, sometimes even impossible, to use in many regions. If your ox dies from diseases, a wagon is going to become useless. And in many places, it was actually, believe it or not, more efficient to just carry it on your head or to, use river canoes. It's adaptation to local geography. If someone uses skis in Alaska and sandals in Florida, we don't conclude that one group is genetically smarter because one group used a certain thing. They're just using different tools because they're in different environments. And here's something that a lot of people forget. Africans did know what wheels were. North Africa, I know North Africans are distinct from Sub-Saharans, but North Africans, they had wheeled vehicles for thousands of years. Ancient Egypt, they used chariots, and trade connected Africa with Europe, the Middle East, and Asia for centuries. So the question would be, why didn't Sub-Saharans invent a wheel? Or why wasn't wheel transport widely adopted in certain regions? So these are completely different questions, obviously. But I think it all boils down to the fact that it just wouldn't have made sense for things to develop that way anyways. Even if they did develop a wheel, it wouldn't have even been practical. Next, he says Europe became successful because Europeans evolved differently. Humans originated in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. Every black person alive today, black, white, Asian, indigenous, we all do belong to the same species, Homo sapiens. Europeans, even though they're mixed with Neanderthal like Asians are, they're not like a newer species. They're descendants of populations that migrated out of Africa. They're basically those same people, just a little bit lighter. So the idea that Africans had a 200,000 year head start over Europeans, that doesn't even make sense. I'm not even trying to be rude or insulting, but that makes zero sense at all. Europeans didn't evolve separately while Africans stood still. They have the same ancestral population. And then he says Africa had perfect weather, unlimited resources, and therefore should have built everything Europe built. I get where he's coming from. That is an oversimplification, and it's not being that honest. First of all, Africa isn't like this giant tropical paradise. It's the most geographically and genetically diverse continent on the planet. You have, like, trying to think off the tip of my head, like the Sahara Desert, you have mountain ranges, dense rainforests, savannas, wetlands, dry regions, seasonal droughts, nutrient poor tropical soils, and environments with diseases that dramatically affected transportation and agriculture. And having natural resources doesn't automatically create industrial civilization. Countries also need political institutions, trade work, stable governments, capital investment, infrastructure, population density, and favorable historical circumstances, which I can admit those Africans in certain areas should have just built, right? But history is a lot more complicated than good weather equals civilization. I do want to validate some of his points. He lists cathedrals, castles, literature, science, exploration as proof of European superiority. Europe absolutely produced incredible achievements, and I don't think anybody should deny that. And I think all of us should be grateful. I know that might sound like I'm cooning or whatever, but the Renaissance happened, the scientific revolution happened, the industrial revolution happened, and those accomplishments deserve recognition and they deserve celebration. But recognizing European achievements doesn't require pretending that the rest of humanity accomplished and did nothing. If you look at Sub-Saharan Africans particularly, they produced great Zimbabwe. You can still see the massive stone architectures today. They developed sophisticated, West Africans, they developed sophisticated iron smelting traditions over 2,500 years ago. The Kingdom of Benin produced incredibly advanced bronze sculptures using the lost wax casting process. the city of Ife created like realistic and naturalistic sculptures centuries before Europeans knew they existed. Timbuktu was one of the world's major centers of scholarship, and it preserved hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, commerce, and religion. And none of those things disappear simply because Europeans later became more powerful and more militaristic. I think we treat history as like a competition where one civilization, succeeding just erases everybody else's accomplishments. I see black and white people doing that. And then he also says without Europeans, Africans would still be speaking in cliques. I mean, that's just false. First, most African languages don't even use cliques. Like if you're talking about a majority, clique languages are concentrated mainly in parts of southern Africa. Secondly, Africa has had writing systems for thousands of years. I know the Egyptians were Kemetic and their descendants are Coptic, so they're not sub-Saharan, right? But they had hieroglyphics. Ethiopians, they developed a certain script. I think it was the Ge'ez script. And there was Arabic in Africa, even though Arabic does come from Arabia. But Nigeria did develop Nitsibidi, I think. The Vai people had their own writing system. The Bamum Kingdom created another. There are a few that I'm thinking of. The famous manuscripts of Timbuktu that contained hundreds of thousands of written documents. So the statement that Africa had no written language is false, and the statement that sub-Saharans in particular had no written language is also false. And then we probably get to like the easiest claim to check. He says white people have 6 extra inches of like brain material. I have no idea what he's talking about. I've observed the anatomy of the brain. There's no brain structure, lobe, or anatomical feature that I was able to see that white people possess and black people lack. Not in neurology, not in anatomy, not in medicine, not anywhere. On average, our skull shapes are different, but that's something that you can even observe within the race. But if you're looking at like modern MRI studies, it doesn't support the claim that white people have like this extra brain matter that black people don't have. I don't know where that comes from. I would be open to hearing about that. I could be wrong. I would be open to a fact check. He says IQ is genetic, therefore racial differences in IQ must also be genetic. That's another misunderstanding in behavioral genetics. Yes, your genes influence intelligence. Almost every scientist agrees with that. But there are some caveats here, and there are some things that people miss. What you inherit within a population, it doesn't always explain differences between populations. And here's an example. If you plant if you plant genetically an identical corn, right? One field has rich soil and the other has poor soil. The corn is the same, but it's going to develop differently in both of those fields, right? So the difference between those two fields is environment, and a lot of people don't like to accept that. But if you're looking at lead exposure, mercury exposure, if you're looking at, I made a video on that, I won't get into that too much, but the pollutants in the black community that obviously had a pernicious effect on the genes, that's just genetics 101, you know what I mean? And that's why virtually every major genetics organization warns against using IQ statistics to rank races genetically, because there are deviations from that. And obviously the exception isn't the rule, but when you grow people in the same environment, typically you see those gaps close. And, that's been observed time and time again. Black people exist across every profession imaginable. No monkey species in the world can be a doctor, an engineer, a scientist, a judge, an entrepreneur, a military officer, a college professor, an astronaut, possibly, business owners, CEOs, artists, athletes, politicians. We're all just as capable as the other person in doing those things. And if your theory has to ignore millions of like counterexamples, then it's probably not a very good theory. And then he says white people have special gifts from the creator. I mean, people are free to have different religious beliefs. If you want to talk about divine favoritism, that's fine. But I prefer to talk about science and biology and history. And modern genetics simply, they don't support the idea that one race is genetically superior to another. I would say on average, you have certain fields where certain people are better. But there isn't like a cathedral gene, there isn't like a science chromosome, there's not like a castle allele. Civilizations rise and they fall because of various things: geography, agriculture, institutions, trade, population density, political stability, accumulated and exchanged knowledge, competition, disease environments, historical contingency. Not because one race received magical DNA for civilization. He said environment played no role. That's absolutely outrageous. Environment plays every single role in the development of identity and the development of race. Like the reason why we even have distinct races is because they were exposed to a different environment. So to say environment has nothing to do with why white people are the way they are, it's not logically consistent, And many different groups did many different things. Europe itself spent centuries learning from civilizations in, the Middle East, North Africa, India, China. Paper came from China, gunpowder came from China, the compass came from China, modern numerals came through India. Classical knowledge was preserved and expanded by scholars in the Islamic world. The Arabs, they enslaved whites for over 1,000 years. And human civilization has always been like, cumulative. Ideas spread, people borrow, cultures innovate. That's how history works. That's how history has always worked. And yes, Europe has achieved extraordinary things. And like I said, I think we should give recognition to that. But it does not logically follow that Europeans are just inherently genetically superior to every population. You could say that they've created things that were superior, but if you have different people that are capable of the same thing in one area, typically those gaps close. Like I said, if somebody's inherently superior, there would be no reality of anybody closing the gap. Like, for example, like with a lot of West Africans in the higher current of the RR and RX genetic alleles, they'll always have a, an inherent speed advantage, with the actin 3 gene, but there's not really much evidence to support that for, white people. And with the muscular anatomy, it's a lot more deliberate. So when you separate history from ideology, the evidence doesn't support the conclusion that he's trying to reach. It's better to fact check everything and do your own research.